Act 1. Cold Open. In the collections of the British Museum in London, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, there are objects that the institutions themselves have described as among the most controversial artifacts in modern archaeological history. They are skulls, carved from single blocks of quartz crystal, no joins, no separate pieces fused together, no assembly. Each one a single, unbroken piece of stone, shaped into the form of a human skull with a level of anatomical precision and surface finish that stops people in their tracks when they encounter it for the first time. They are beautiful, they are unsettling, and they have generated more serious academic arguments, more popular mythology, and more outright fraud than almost any class of object in the history of archaeological collecting. For much of the 20th century, crystal skulls were presented to the public as ancient Mesoamerican artifacts, the sacred objects of the Aztec or Maya civilizations, carved centuries or millennia before European contact, whose origins and purpose remained mysterious. The claim that accompanied the most famous of them, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, was even more dramatic. Discovered, supposedly, in the ruins of a Maya city in the jungle of what is now Belize, the skull was described by its keeper as thousands of years old, as possessing measurable paranormal properties, and as having been examined by the engineers at Hewlett-Packard, who concluded, or so the story went, that it could not have been carved by human hands at all. Indiana Jones chased one across South America in a 2008 blockbuster film. And then, in 2008, the same year, Indiana Jones raced across cinema screens. The British Museum and the Smithsonian Institution jointly published the most detailed scientific analysis of crystal skulls ever conducted. The results were not ambiguous, not ancient, not Aztec, not Maya, not miraculous. Made in the 19th century, in Europe, by craftsmen using rotary lapidary tools and industrial abrasives, and sold to a credulous collecting market by one of the most accomplished antiquities dealers in European history. But here is the thing, the story does not end with science. Because the science, as thorough, as peer-reviewed, as unambiguous as it is, opens a different set of questions that are, in many ways, more interesting than the ones it closes. Who made these objects? How? Why were they made? How did they enter the collections of three of the world's most prestigious museums without anyone noticing for decades? Who was the man at the center of the entire story, and what did he actually know? And what, in the end, do these extraordinarily skilled objects, whatever century they come from, tell us about the human impulse to create something that outlasts the truth we tell about it? Today, we follow the crystal skull from the jungles of Belize to the laboratories of the British Museum. We follow the money, the forgery, and the science. And we ask what happens when an object is more interesting than the lie that made it famous. Act 2. What quartz is and why it matters. Before we examine the skulls themselves, we need to understand what they are made of, because without that understanding, the craftsmanship involved and the controversy around it makes no sense. Quartz, silicon dioxide, the second most abundant mineral in the Earth's continental crust. You have seen it everywhere, in beach sand, in granite, in the glassy veins that run through mountain rock faces. In its pure crystalline form, it grows in hexagonal prisms of extraordinary clarity, sometimes reaching lengths of several meters and weights of several tons in large geological formations. Quartz registers 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, the standard 10-point scale that geologists use to measure a mineral's resistance to scratching. To put that in context, a steel knife blade sits at approximately 5 to 6. Glass sits at 5.5. Human fingernails sit at 2.5. Diamond, the hardest natural substance on Earth, sits at 10. Quartz at 7 means this: you cannot scratch quartz with a steel tool. A steel blade drawn across quartz leaves no mark. The quartz scratches the steel. To carve quartz, to shape it, to cut it, to create precise detail in its surface, you need to use an abrasive material harder than 7 on the Mohs scale. You need corundum, which is 9. You need diamond powder, which is 10. Or you need sand loaded with garnet, which reaches between 7 and 8. All of these will scratch and abrade quartz if applied with sufficient force and technique. But here is the additional complication. Natural quartz crystals are not simply hard. They have an internal crystalline structure, a regular geometric arrangement of silicon and oxygen atoms that repeats through the entire volume of the stone. This structure has a direction, a grain. And when you carve quartz, the direction in which you apply force relative to that internal grain matters enormously. Carve with the grain along the natural cleavage planes of the crystal, and the stone responds relatively predictably. Carve against the grain across those cleavage planes, and the stone wants to fracture, to split unpredictably, to shatter along its internal structure rather than being shaped by your tool. The skulls we are going to examine were carved from single crystals, no assembly, no joins. This means the carver had to work in 3 dimensions simultaneously, shaping a complex organic form, a human skull with eye sockets, nasal cavity, teeth, cheekbones from a single piece of stone, managing the grain direction throughout, without once making the kind of error that could not be undone. In quartz, there are no second chances. You cannot fill a crack. You cannot refuse a fracture. If the stone splits at the wrong moment, the entire object is lost. You start again with a new crystal. There is one more property of quartz that became central to the mythology surrounding these skulls, and we should understand it clearly before we encounter that mythology. Quartz is piezoelectric. Piezoelectricity is the property of certain materials to generate an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, when squeezed, bent, or struck. Quartz was the first piezoelectric material to be scientifically characterized by the physicist Pierre Curie and his brother Jacques in 1880. It is why quartz crystal oscillators are used in almost every electronic device made today, in watches, in computers, in microphones, in sonar equipment. When an electrical voltage is applied to a quartz crystal, it vibrates at a precise, stable frequency. When that vibration is measured, you have a clock accurate to within seconds per year. This is real, documented, industrially applied physics. It has nothing demonstrably, scientifically, measurably, nothing to do with the paranormal properties that crystal skull promoters have spent decades claiming these objects possess. But the gap between the genuine scientific reality of quartz's interesting properties and the mythology that grew up around them is one of the most important things to understand about the crystal skull story. Because that gap, the space between the real and the imagined, is where the forgeries lived. Act 3. The objects themselves. There are, by current count, approximately 13 crystal skulls that have attracted serious archaeological or scientific attention. Many more exist in private collections, some of them obvious tourist market productions. The ones that matter to our investigation are the handful that have been in major institutional collections or subject to serious scientific analysis. Let us meet them. The British Museum skull. The most famous institutionally held crystal skull sits in room 27 of the British Museum. It is life-sized, approximately 15 centimeters tall, and carved from a single block of colorless, transparent quartz crystal. Its surface is polished to a high clarity. The eye sockets are hollowed. The teeth are rendered in considerable detail. The zygomatic arches, the cheekbones are indicated. The overall form is recognizably, carefully, a human skull. It is beautiful in the unsettling way that all human skull imagery is beautiful, the way it holds both life and death in the same form. The British Museum acquired it in 1897, purchasing it from the luxury jewelry house Tiffany & Company in New York for $950. Tiffany's had purchased it from a French antiquities dealer named Eugène Boban. Boban claimed it had come from Mexico. The British Museum catalogued it as possibly Aztec. For the first decades of its display, no one looked at it too closely. The Smithsonian skull. In 1992, the Smithsonian Institution received an unusual package. Someone had mailed them a crystal skull, anonymously, with a note claiming that it was an Aztec artifact from the collection of Porfirio Diaz, the former dictator of Mexico who had been deposed in 1911. No other provenance was offered, no name, no return address. The Smithsonian skull is larger than the British Museum example made from white rather than clear quartz, with a slightly different surface treatment. It is, if anything, technically more demanding than the London skull by virtue of its size. Its anonymous arrival should perhaps have been the first indication that something was unusual about its history. The Mitchell-Hedges skull. This is the one that made the mythology. The Mitchell-Hedges skull is the most technically accomplished of all the major crystal skulls. It is carved from absolutely clear, optically high-grade quartz. It is anatomically more accurate than any of the others. The teeth are individually rendered with something approaching dental precision, the nasal cavity is properly proportioned, the temporal ridges are present, the occipital protuberance at the base of the skull is correctly placed. And, uniquely among all the major skulls, it has a detachable lower jaw. The lower jaw is not attached. It was carved separately but from the same single crystal as the skull itself, meaning that the crystal was first shaped as a single piece and then cut to separate the jaw, leaving two perfectly matched surfaces. The jaw fits back against the skull with a precision that, according to everyone who has handled both pieces, is extraordinary. They mate together as though they were never separated. The optical properties of this skull are remarkable in a way that deserves explanation. Quartz crystal is an excellent light conductor. When illuminated from below, when light enters through the base of the skull, the internal geometry of the crystal distributes that light through the volume of the stone and concentrates it in the eye sockets. Under certain lighting conditions, the Mitchell-Hedges skull's empty eye sockets appear to glow from within, not supernaturally, optically. The physics of light transmission through a shaped quartz crystal produces this effect, but the visual result, in a darkened room, is genuinely striking. Anna Mitchell-Hedges, the woman who claimed to have discovered it in a Mayan ruin in 1924, spent the rest of her life, until she passed away in 2007 at the age of 100, carrying this object around the world and demonstrating its properties to audiences who found it as captivating as she did. She claimed it was ancient, that it possessed healing properties, that it could project images, that it could predict major world events. She was a compelling storyteller. She was also, the evidence strongly suggests, protecting a fiction that had begun not in a Mayan ruin in Belize, but at Sotheby's auction house in London in October 1943. We will return to this. The Paris Skull. The skull, held at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, entered the French national collections in 1878, when the explorer and ethnographer Alphonse Pinart donated his collection of Mesoamerican artifacts to the Trocadero, the institution that preceded the Musée de l'Homme and eventually the Quai Branly. Pinart had purchased his collection from Eugène Bobin. 3 crystal skulls were in the Pinart donation. In 2009, French researchers from the Centre de Recherche et de Restauration des Musées de France, the C2RMF, published a detailed study of the Paris skull. They used scanning electron microscopy and a dating technique called quartz hydration dating, which measures the rate at which water molecules are absorbed into the surface of freshly cut quartz. Their conclusion: the Paris skull was carved after 1740. The SEM confirmed rotary tool marks throughout. So, 4 major skulls, 4 different institutions on 3 continents, all appearing in the historical record within the same narrow window of the 19th century. All subsequently found by electron microscopy to carry the marks of rotary lapidary tools. The question of why they all appeared at the same moment in the same market, and who was responsible for putting them there, leads directly to one man. Act 4. Eugène Bobin. Eugène Bobin was born around 1834, probably in Paris. He arrived in Mexico City as a young man around 1857 fresh, according to one account, from the California goldfields, where he had apparently failed to strike it rich and was looking for the next opportunity. He found one. Mexico in the late 1850s was in political turmoil. The Reform War was raging between liberal and conservative factions, and the country's institutions were fragile enough that an enterprising young Frenchman with a talent for languages could make himself useful in unexpected ways. Bobin learned Spanish. He learned Nahuatl, the Aztec language. He developed a genuine affection for Mexican culture and an expert's eye for pre-Columbian artifacts. He began trading. His timing turned out to be excellent. In 1863, Louis Napoleon sent a French army into Mexico, installed Maximilian von Habsburg of Austria as emperor, and established a French scientific commission to document and collect evidence of Mexico's ancient civilizations. Bobin, fluent, knowledgeable, already established as a dealer, was named archaeological consultant to the commission in 1865. He promptly began advertising himself as antiquarian to the emperor, which, to be fair, was accurate. The commission sent a selection of Bobin's pre-Columbian artifacts to Paris for display at the Exposition Universelle in 1867, the Great World's Fair, at which Paris presented itself to the world as the center of civilization, science, and culture. Among the objects exhibited in Bobin's display were 2 crystal skulls. They are visible in the photograph taken at the exhibition, the photograph that shows Bobin himself, seated with his collection spread around him, presenting himself as the authoritative intermediary between ancient Mexico and the modern world, and at his feet, clearly visible, a pot and a battle axe that he labeled as Aztec. Both were later identified as fakes. In March 1869, Boban sailed from Veracruz to Paris, ending 12 years in Mexico. He brought his collection with him. In Paris, he opened an antiquities shop. He sold to ethnographers, to museums, to private collectors, and to the growing market of wealthy individuals who wanted something dramatic for their cabinets of curiosity. In the 1870s, he sold a significant portion of his collection, including crystal skulls, to the French ethnographer Alphonse Pinart, who donated it to the Trocadero in 1878. 3 skulls, including what became the Paris skull, were in that donation. Then, in the 1880s and 90s, the large life-size skull, the one that would eventually reach the British Museum, passed through Boban's hands. He attempted to sell it to the National Museum of Mexico in 1886. The museum's director, Gumecindo Mendoza, refused it. The director wrote that he was unable to authenticate the skull as a genuine pre-Columbian object and recommended against purchase. Boban, irritated, took the skull to New York, where he auctioned it off in 1886. It passed through several hands before reaching Tiffany & Company, who sold it to the British Museum in 1897. Now, where did the skulls come from? The evidence points to Idar Oberstein. Idar Oberstein is a small town in the Rhineland region of western Germany, on the Nahe River. In the 19th century, and to some extent to this day, it was the most important gemstone carving center in Europe. The workshops of Idar Oberstein produced lapidary work of extraordinary quality in every variety of stone, including quartz. They had been doing so for centuries. Their craftsmen worked foot-operated grinding wheels and rotary cutting discs coated with abrasive compounds, the precise technology that the 2008 electron microscopy study found in the tool marks of the British Museum and Smithsonian skulls. The connection between Boban and Idar Oberstein has been documented by Jane Walsh, the Smithsonian anthropologist who spent years researching the crystal skull provenance trail. Walsh found that Boban had documented commercial relationships with suppliers in the German gemstone industry, and that crystal objects similar to the skulls were catalogued in German mineralogy collections by the 1860s, contemporaneous with Boban's first exhibition of skull objects in Paris. The most likely scenario, supported by the documentary and scientific evidence, is this. Boban, who understood the Mexican collecting market, who had excellent contacts in European lapidary trade, and who had a demonstrated history of selling objects of dubious authenticity, commissioned the skulls from German workshops, brought them to Mexico, or claimed Mexican provenance for pieces he had already acquired in Europe, and sold them into a collecting market that was primed by the romance of the French intervention and the broader European fascination with pre-Columbian civilization. He was not stupid, he was not careless, he was, by the standards of his era, operating in a market where the demand for authenticated pre-Columbian objects dramatically exceeded the supply of genuine ones, and where the boundary between authentic collecting and creative provenance was, at best, fluid. He was an operator of the first order, and the skulls were his masterwork. But there is one skull that Boban did not sell, one skull that appeared in the record not in the 1860s or 1870s, but in 1943, one skull whose story is far stranger and far more deliberately constructed than anything Boban produced, the Mitchell Hedges skull. And to understand it, we need to go to the jungle. Act 5. Mitchell Hedges. Frederick Albert Mitchell Hedges was born in London in 1882. He left school early, worked at a newspaper, served in the military, drifted through a series of occupations, and eventually arrived at the identity that he would maintain for the rest of his life: explorer, adventurer, author, and he hoped world-famous archaeologist. He was a magnificent self-promoter. He claimed, over his lifetime, to have fought with Pancho Villa in the Mexican Revolution, to have discovered the lost city of Atlantis beneath the Caribbean, to have been captured by indigenous people multiple times and survived, and to have found in the ruins of a Maya city in the jungle of what was then British Honduras a crystal skull that was, variously, 3,600 years old, the work of ancient craftsmen who spent 150 years polishing it with sand, and the skull of a high priest of the Maya civilization who had been ritually killed over its surface. Almost none of this was true. The evidence for almost none of it exists. But Frederick Mitchell Hedges understood something important. In the 1920s and 30s, with mass media expanding rapidly and the public appetite for archaeological adventure at its highest, This was the era of Howard Carter opening Tutankhamun's tomb. Of the romanticized archaeology of the popular imagination, you could build a career on a compelling story if you told it with enough confidence. He told it with extraordinary confidence. Let us look at what actually happened at Lubantun in 1924. Lubantun, meaning place of fallen stones in Yucatec Maya, is a real archaeological site in what is now the Toledo district of Belize. It was a significant ceremonial center of the late Classic Maya period, occupied from approximately 730 to 890 AD. It has impressive stone platform architecture and has been the subject of legitimate archaeological study for over a century. It was documented by the archaeologist Dr. Thomas Gann in 1903 and published in multiple academic papers. By 1924, it was a known site. Mitchell Hedges did not discover it. He accompanied Gann on the 1924 expedition as a participant, not as its leader. There are extensive photographs from the 1924 Lubantun expedition. The site was well documented by the team. There is not a single photograph from the 1924 expedition that shows the skull or its discovery. Not one. There is no contemporary field journal entry recording the finding of a crystal skull at Lubantun in 1924. No note, no letter, no report, no newspaper account. Nothing that was written at the time of the expedition by any member of it mentions a crystal skull. Mitchell Hedges himself did not mention the skull until his autobiography, Danger My Ally, published in 1951, 27 years after the supposed discovery. He wrote of it only cryptically. How it came into my possession I have reason for not revealing. That sentence, how it came into my possession I have reason for not revealing, is Mitchell Hedges in a nutshell. The showman's flourish, the implication of a secret, is more dramatic than the truth. And we know the truth, because a letter exists. In December 1943, Frederick Mitchell Hedges wrote to his brother. The letter, recovered by researchers, states clearly that he had recently acquired a crystal skull at auction. The auction was at Sotheby's in London in October 1943. The seller was a London art dealer named Sidney Burney. The price paid was £400 at Sotheby's in London in 1943. Not discovered in a Mayan ruin in Belize in 1924, purchased at auction from a London dealer in 1943. Anna Mitchell Hedges, his adopted daughter, who was supposedly 17 years old when she found the skull on her birthday, told the story for the rest of her long life. She passed away in 2007 at the age of 100, having spent 6 decades as the skull's keeper, exhibitor, and advocate. She was devoted to the object. By all accounts, she believed, genuinely and deeply, in its significance. Whether she also believed, genuinely and deeply, in the specific narrative of the Lubantun discovery, or whether she had, at some point, made a decision to protect a story she knew to be constructed is something only she could have answered, and she never did. What she did say changed over time. The date of the discovery shifted between tellings. The circumstances shifted. The skull was found under an altar. No, it was found buried in sand. The jaw was found immediately adjacent. No, it was found 3 months later and some distance away. These inconsistencies are not minor memory lapses across a long life. They are the pattern of someone telling a story they did not directly witness. After Mitchell Hedges Sr. passed away in 1959, Anna took the skull to art restorer Frank Dorland, who arranged for it to be examined at Hewlett-Packard's Crystal Oscillator Laboratory in Santa Clara, California in 1971. The Hewlett-Packard study has been the cornerstone of the skull's alternative mythology ever since. Dorland claimed that the HP engineers concluded the skull showed no tool marks under optical magnification, that it had been carved against the crystal's axis, which should have shattered it, and that it would have taken between 150 years and 300 years of continuous hand polishing to produce. What the Hewlett-Packard engineers actually said was considerably more modest. They confirmed the skull was made of quartz. They confirmed the optical quality of the crystal was high. They noted they could not see obvious tool marks under standard optical magnification. Scanning electron microscopy, the technology that definitively resolves the question, was not used. When the Mitchell Hedges skull was subsequently examined with electron microscopy by researchers who had also studied the British Museum and Smithsonian skulls, the finding was consistent with all the others. Rotary tool marks, the marks of a lapidary wheel, the same technology, the same era. The skull is extraordinary. The craftsmanship is real. The optics are genuine. The skill required to produce it was immense. The story of Lubantun is not. Act 6. The Science. In 2005, the British Museum and the Smithsonian Institution began a formal joint research project into the crystal skulls in their respective collections. The project was led by Margaret Sachs and Nigel Meeks at the British Museum and Jane Walsh at the Smithsonian, with the analytical chemistry contribution of Ian Freestone and Andrew Rankin. Their findings were published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in May 2008. The paper is called The Origins of Two Purportedly Pre-Columbian Mexican Crystal Skulls. It is not a long paper. It does not need to be. Let us walk through what it found, because the methodology is as important as the conclusion. Stage 1. What tool were used? The researchers could not directly examine the skull's surfaces. The objects are too valuable and the surface too fragile for direct contact with analytical instruments. Instead, they made highly detailed molds of the carved features, particularly the teeth, which have the most complex surface geometry, using a special silicone wax. These molds were then examined under a scanning electron microscope. The SEM fires a focused beam of electrons at a surface and measures the way those electrons are reflected back. It generates images of extraordinary clarity and depth at magnifications impossible with optical microscopy, from 50 times up to several thousand times. At these magnifications, the character of the marks left by different cutting tools becomes unmistakable. Here is what tool marks look like on authentic pre-Columbian Mesoamerican quartz carvings, and the researchers had exactly these for comparison. A Mixtec rock crystal goblet from a documented excavation. 5 Aztec rock crystal beads from secure archaeological contexts. Under the SEM, the authentic pre-Columbian carvings show shallow, irregular indentations. Scratches that vary in direction. Shallow grooves that wander slightly, consistent with a handheld abrasive tool, a piece of hard stone, or wood tipped with garnet grit, being worked by hand in multiple directions across the surface. The marks are consistent with patient hand grinding. They are organic. They are imprecise, in the way that handwork is imprecise. The British Museum skull shows something completely different. Its carved features, particularly the teeth, show concentric, parallel, curvilinear striations. Regular, circular, repeating. The marks of a rotary disc tool, a wheel spinning at consistent speed, with an abrasive compound on its edge, being pressed against the surface of the stone in controlled passes. The marks are, in the words of the researchers, characteristic of high-speed rotary carving tools. In plain language, a lapidary wheel, a machine, a tool that the ancient Aztec and Maya did not have, and which entered the gemstone carving industry in Europe in the industrial era. There is no ambiguity in the images. The comparison between the authentic hand tool marks on the Mixtec goblet and the rotary marks on the British Museum skull is, under the electron microscope, as clear as the comparison between handwriting and typeface. Stage 2. What abrasive was used? To cut quartz, your tool needs an abrasive coating harder than 7 on the Mohs scale. The researchers examined the skulls for residual abrasive material still present in the carved features, microscopic particles trapped in the grooves. The British Museum skull was carved using a harsh abrasive compound consistent with corundum aluminium oxide, hardness 9 on the Mohs scale, or diamond powder, hardness 10. Both were used in 19th century European lapidary workshops. Neither was used in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica in the form consistent with these marks. The Smithsonian skull provides the most definitive single piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Its residual abrasive was silicon carbide. Silicon carbide, also known commercially as carborundum, is a synthetic compound. It does not occur naturally. It was first synthesized by the American chemist Edward Acheson in 1891, as he was attempting to make artificial diamonds. Acheson failed to make diamonds, but accidentally produced silicon carbide instead, patented his process, and began commercial production the same year. Silicon carbide is harder than corundum, between 9 and 9.5 on the Mohs scale. It is an excellent abrasive for cutting hard stone. The gemstone industry adopted it rapidly after 1891. The Smithsonian skull was carved using an abrasive that did not exist before 1891, not 3,000 years before Christ, not 1,000 years before Christ, not even 100 years before Christ, after 1891. That single chemical finding is, on its own, sufficient to close the question of whether the Smithsonian skull is a pre-Columbian artifact. It is not. Stage 3. Where did the quartz come from? Quartz from different geological sources has different internal chemistry, different trace element concentrations, different types of fluid and mineral inclusions within the crystal structure. These are geological fingerprints. By examining the inclusions in the British Museum skull's quartz using Raman spectroscopy, the researchers were able to determine that the crystal was not sourced from Mesoamerica. Its inclusions are consistent with quartz from Brazil or Madagascar, not Mexico, not Guatemala, not Belize. Brazil or Madagascar, both of which were, by the late 19th century, significant sources of quartz crystal supplied to European lapidary workshops, including those of Idar Oberstein. Stage 4. Authentic comparison. Throughout this analysis, the researchers kept returning to their comparison objects, the genuine pre-Columbian Mesoamerican quartz carvings from authenticated excavation contexts. The authentic objects show hand tool marks throughout, no rotary striations, abrasives consistent with garnet or corundum in handheld application. Quartz sourced from Central American deposits, the skulls show rotary marks throughout, abrasives, corundum or silicon carbide applied mechanically, quartz from South Atlantic or Indian Ocean sources. Two completely different technological traditions, visible in every surface examined. The conclusion of the 2008 paper is stated plainly. The British Museum skull was manufactured in the 19th century, almost certainly in Europe. The Smithsonian skull was manufactured no earlier than 1891. There is no version of this finding that is ambiguous or open to reinterpretation. The physics and chemistry of tool marks and abrasive residues do not accommodate alternative readings. The skulls are not ancient, they are not Aztec, they are not Maya. They are extraordinarily skilled examples of 19th century European lapidary craftsmanship, sold into a collecting market as ancient Mesoamerican artifacts by people who understood the commercial value of the story better than the moral cost of the deception. Act 7. Persisting questions. Now, let us ask the questions the science leaves open. Because the 2008 study settled the question of when and where the skulls were made, it did not settle every question about them. First question. How skilled were the makers? Let us be clear about something that the debunking narrative tends to flatten. The craftsmen who made these objects, whoever they were, in whatever Idar Oberstein workshop they worked, were exceptionally good at their jobs. Carving a life-sized human skull from a single block of quartz with no joins and no assembly, to the level of anatomical accuracy these objects display, using 19th century lapidary tools, is not a trivial accomplishment. It is not something a mediocre craftsman produces. It required an understanding of the material, an understanding of anatomy, and a level of manual skill that put these objects at the highest end of the 19th century European lapidary tradition. The Mitchell-Hedges skull in particular, with its detachable jaw cut from the same crystal, its high optical clarity, and its anatomical precision represents a level of craft that, even knowing when and how it was made, demands respect. These objects were not cheap fakes designed to fool a casual buyer. They were expensive, time-consuming, technically demanding productions designed to command serious prices from serious collectors. The British Museum paid $950 in 1897, a significant sum. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was purchased at Sotheby's for £400. Whatever else they are masterworks of their actual tradition, which is Victorian European lapidary craft. Second question. Why did three major museums buy them? The British Museum, the Smithsonian, and the Quay Branly are three of the world's most respected institutions. They have professional curatorial staff, scientific resources, and established authentication procedures. All three have crystal skulls in their collections that are, as science has now established, 19th century forgeries. How? The answer reveals something important about the history of museum collecting. In the late 19th century, the scientific tools available to authenticate archaeological objects were extremely limited compared to what is available today. Provenance, the documented history of an object's ownership, was the primary authentication method. The narrative Boban provided was coherent. Mexico, where he had genuinely spent years and genuinely built a reputation as an expert, was the source. The objects looked ancient. No one had a comparative database of authenticated pre-Columbian quartz carvings against which to check them. The tools that would have exposed them, scanning electron microscopy, Raman spectroscopy, silicon carbide identification, did not exist, or were not routinely applied to archaeological objects. The British Museum has not hidden the skull since learning the truth. It is still on display. The label now says something rather different than Aztec artifact. But the skull remains, because as the museum argues, its history as an object of forgery and mythology is itself historically significant. It tells us something true about the Victorian collecting world, about the forgery market, about the relationship between European institutions and the cultures they were drawing on for their collections. This is a defensible position. It is also, admittedly, convenient for an institution that would otherwise have to acknowledge it paid $950 for a fake in 1897. Third question. Why do people still believe? In 2008, the same year, the British Museum and Smithsonian published their definitive study, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, was released globally. It was not a scientifically rigorous film. The same year that the world's leading archaeological institutions settled the crystal skull question with peer-reviewed evidence, Hollywood provided a global audience of hundreds of millions with a narrative in which crystal skulls were alien artifacts with paranormal powers. The mythology of crystal skulls has outlived the science that debunked it, not because the science is wrong or contested, but because the mythology answers a need that the science does not. Human beings are attracted to the idea of objects with power, to the notion that certain physical things carry within them some residue of the extraordinary of ancient knowledge, of supernatural capability, of a contact with the divine that ordinary life does not provide. The crystal skull, with its hollow eyes and its clear, cold surface and its suggestion of editor bleep holding light within itself, is exactly the kind of object that invites this projection. And Anna Mitchell Hedges, holding the skull in her aged hands, telling her story for the 100th time to an audience that wanted it to be true, was a human embodiment of the same thing. She gave her life to an object. Whether it deserved that devotion on the terms she described it is one question. Whether the devotion itself was real, whether the attachment between a person and an object can carry its own kind of truth, even when the story built around the object is false, is a more interesting one. What the crystal skulls actually are, stripped of the mythology, examined under the electron microscope, traced through the provenance records to Idar Oberstein and Eugène Boban and Sotheby's in 1943, is something that the forgery narrative doesn't quite capture. They are objects created for deception that outlived their deception. They are so well made that the deception itself became a kind of testament, a demonstration that someone, somewhere, in the gemstone workshops of 19th century Germany, could produce something so extraordinary that 3 of the world's greatest museums believed it was ancient for decades. And they are still in those museums, still drawing visitors, still provoking the response that all great objects provoke, the stopped breath, the wondering look, the question that forms before knowledge can answer it. What is this? Who made it? Why? The answers are less magical than the questions, but the questions, at least, are as alive as they ever were. Act 8. The broader pattern. The crystal skulls did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from one of the most vigorous forgery markets in the history of archaeology, operating in one of the most credulous periods for the authentication of ancient objects, the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. The same era that produced the crystal skulls produced the Piltdown Man, the fake fossilized human skull planted in a gravel pit in East Sussex in 1912 and accepted as a genuine missing link in human evolution by the scientific establishment for 41 years before being definitively exposed as a forgery in 1953. It produced the Vinland Map, a supposedly 15th century chart showing Norse exploration of North America, exposed as a forgery by ink analysis. It produced dozens of ancient Egyptian papyri, pre-Columbian gold objects, and Phoenician inscriptions that turned out, on close examination, to be products of the same European workshop culture that made the skulls. This is not simply a story about individual criminals, it is a story about a market. In the second half of the 19th century, the European appetite for objects from ancient and non-European civilizations was enormous and only partially satisfied by legitimate supply. Museums were competing to build collections. Wealthy collectors were competing to display the exotic. The romantic imagination of the era projected extraordinary qualities onto pre-Columbian civilizations, partly from genuine admiration, partly from the imperial perspective that saw primitive cultures as closer to the mysterious and the supernatural than the industrialized present. Into this market, Eugène Boban was one of many operators who understood that the supply of genuine ancient objects was always going to be exceeded by demand, and that a well-constructed object with a plausible story would find a buyer. What made the crystal skulls special, what elevated them above ordinary fakes, was the choice of material. Quartz has something. We established this in the first act of our investigation. The way it transmits light, the piezoelectric properties, the hardness that seems to speak of endurance and permanence. There is a reason that across dozens of cultures, from the indigenous peoples of the Americas to Buddhist traditions in East and Southeast Asia, to the New Age movements of the 20th century, quartz crystal has been associated with clarity, power, and the supernatural. The people who commissioned or made these objects chose quartz specifically, not because it was easy, it was not, as we have seen. Not because it was cheap, the labor required was expensive, but because quartz, shaped into a skull, produces a genuinely remarkable object, something that looks like it should not exist, something that prompts the question before knowledge can answer it. Meanwhile, the actual pre-Columbian lapidary tradition, the tradition of genuine Aztec and Maya stone carving, is extraordinary in its own right, without any need for forgery or mythology. Authentic Aztec stone carvings in serpentine, jade, and obsidian demonstrate mastery of hard stone carving at a level that required generations of accumulated technical knowledge. The jade mosaic masks of the Maya, produced using handheld abrasive tools and patient grinding across years of work, are among the most technically demanding objects produced anywhere in the ancient world. The turquoise mosaic pieces in the British Museum's own Mesoamerican collection are genuine masterworks of a genuine tradition. The tragedy of the crystal skull forgeries is not simply that 3 major museums were deceived. It is that the forgeries' mythology, the claims of mysterious power and paranormal properties that captured the public imagination, drew attention and fascination toward fake objects and away from the genuine achievements of the civilizations they were falsely attributed to. The Aztec and Maya did not need to have made crystal skulls to be impressive. They were impressive. The crystal skulls were never theirs. What then do we make of the institutions that still display them? The British Museum's crystal skull is still in room 27. It is not hidden. The display text explains its 19th century origin, its Boban provenance, and the electron microscopy findings. The museum argues that the skull's history as a forgery is itself historically significant, that it tells a true story about the Victorian collecting world, about the intersection of antiquarianism and deception, about the objects that European institutions chose to acquire and why. This argument has merit. An object does not need to be what it was claimed to be in order to be interesting. The skull is genuinely interesting, as an object, as a story, as a symptom of its era. But there is a more honest version of that argument, which the museums are sometimes reluctant to make. We kept it because we paid a great deal of money for it, and because thousands of people come to see it, and because the mythology, even the debunked mythology, draws visitors. Which is also, in its way, a true story about institutions and the objects they choose to display. Act 9. The Verdict. Let us lay out, clearly and simply, what the evidence establishes. The crystal skulls in the British Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, the Musée du Quai Branly, and the Mitchell-Hedges collection are not ancient Mesoamerican artifacts. The British Museum's skull was carved in the 19th century using a rotary disc lapidary tool and corundum or diamond abrasive from quartz sourced in Brazil or Madagascar, almost certainly in the gemstone carving workshops of Idar Oberstein, Germany, and sold into the collecting market by the French antiquities dealer Eugène Boban. The Smithsonian skull was carved no earlier than 1891 because the abrasive used to carve it, silicon carbide, was not synthesized before that year. It was mailed anonymously to the Smithsonian in 1992 with a false provenance. The Paris skull passed through Boban's hands and was found by the Centre de Recherche et de Restauration des Musées de France to have been carved after 1740 using lapidary machine tools. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was purchased by Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges at a Sotheby's auction in London in October 1943 for £400 from an art dealer named Sidney Burney. His own letter to his brother in December of the same year confirms this. The story of its discovery in a Maya ruin in Belize in 1924 has no contemporary documentation, no photograph, no journal entry, no report written at the time. These are the facts. They are documented, they are peer-reviewed, they are not contested by any serious academic institution. What the evidence also establishes, and what is equally true, if less dramatic, is that the people who made these objects were genuinely skilled. The craftsmen of Idar Oberstein who produced the skulls for Boban's market were working at the highest level of their tradition. The Mitchell Hedges skull in particular is, on its own terms, a masterwork of lapidary art, a demonstration of what a supremely skilled craftsman with 19th century European tools and a block of exceptional quartz crystal could produce. The mythology around these objects is false. The objects themselves are not nothing. What the crystal skull story is really about underneath the forgery, underneath the mythology, underneath Indiana Jones, is the human relationship with beautiful, inexplicable seeming objects. We want there to be things that exceed explanation. We want the world to hold more than the visible record allows. We want an empty stone eye socket to hold something, some residue of the extraordinary, some contact with a knowledge or power that the ordinary world does not provide. Quartz, crystal, carved into the shape of a human skull, held up to the light so that its hollow eyes glow, this object serves that want. It always has. It served it when Boban's German craftsmen were polishing it for the Paris market. It served it when Anna Mitchell Hedges was carrying it around the world in a locked case. It serves it today when visitors to room 27 of the British Museum stop in front of the display case and feel, for just a moment, before knowledge arrives to answer the question, that they are looking at something they cannot explain. The skull doesn't need to be ancient for that feeling to be real. The feeling is real. The skull is impressive. And Eugène Boban, wherever he ended his life, knew exactly what he was doing when he commissioned an object that would still be stopping people in their tracks 160 years later. He made something that outlasted the lie. That, in the end, may be the most extraordinary thing about the crystal skulls. Not that they fooled 3 of the world's greatest museums. Not that they inspired a global mythology of paranormal properties and alien origins. But that the craftsmen who made them, whose names we do not know, who worked in a workshop in a small German town and never received credit for objects that made other people famous, produced something so compelling, so technically accomplished, so perfectly suited to the human desire for mystery, that 160 years of scientific analysis has not managed to make it less interesting. The electron microscope showed us the tool marks. It showed us when they were made and how. It did not take away the glow. Subscribe to FactFile and like this video, because this case is closed. See you in the next one. Thank you for watching.